It was another Monday morning at the office, and the hum of fluorescent lights above me seemed louder than usual. The same cold coffee sat in front of me, a reminder that mornings weren't meant for enthusiasm. I'd been with the company for 15 years now, and nothing had really changed. The job stayed the same. The department remained underappreciated, and I continued to be the one who fixed everyone else's mistakes from the shadows. No applause, no recognition, just the steady ticking of the clock as the days blurred together. Today, however, felt different. There was an undercurrent of anticipation in the air. A new CTO was coming in. I didn't expect it to matter. New hires were a common thing, and the company often shuffled leaders in and out like pieces on a chessboard. But something about this one felt off. The staff meeting was starting in the conference room, and I found my seat at the far end of the table, as usual, next to the old projector screen that had seen better days. I wasn't there to be noticed. I was just here to make sure the paperwork got filed correctly and that everyone stayed within the lines. When Alex Chase walked in, the room seemed to pause. He was everything you'd expect from a Silicon Valley tech whiz, sharp suit, perfect hair, and that smug confidence that came with his freshly minted MBA. He barely acknowledged anyone in the room, his eyes scanning over the faces like he was inspecting a bunch of files, useless files. When his gaze met mine, he didn't even offer a handshake. Instead, he walked straight to the front, adjusting the microphone with unnecessary flourish. "All right, let's get started," he said, and his voice was filled with the kind of casual arrogance you couldn't miss. "I'm here to change things around. We need to focus on agility, speed, and innovation. Compliance, I assume, is just paperwork." He chuckled to himself, like it was some inside joke we weren't privy to. The room laughed, soft and nervous. No one challenged him. I stayed silent, my jaw tight but unmoving. It wasn't the first time I'd heard the dismissive joke, but something about the way he said it, so casually, felt different. It wasn't just about compliance, it was about me. And it was the first time I had a feeling that things were about to get worse. I set my hands on the table, fingers pressed against the cold wood. For a moment, I allowed myself to feel the sting of being reduced to a punchline, but I didn't let it show. Instead, I took a deep breath, knowing that the silence was the only thing that would give me power in this room. I had spent 15 years here, quietly working in the background, fixing what others couldn't see, cleaning up messes before anyone knew they existed. The company ran like a machine, and I was the oil that kept it from grinding to a halt. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was necessary. I never asked for the spotlight. I never needed it. My job was simple: make sure everything ran smoothly, ensure that every vendor followed protocol, that every report was filed on time, and that compliance was maintained without drama. I wasn't the face of the company, but I had built a career being invisible. But then, Alex Chase showed up. At first, I didn't think much of it. Another new executive to join the ever-growing roster of leaders who would eventually leave or be shuffled out. I was used to them. But Alex, he was different. He didn't just ignore my role, he actively worked to diminish it. It started small. A comment here, a question there. "You're the compliance person." "Right," he'd ask, as if I were some outdated relic. Or the times he'd dismiss my concerns about vendor contracts with a wave of his hand and a laugh. "It's just paperwork," he'd say, as if my years of expertise could be boiled down to a few sheets of forms. Soon, the exclusions began. I was left out of the key meetings, the ones where decisions about vendor partnerships and audits were being made. At first, I told myself it didn't matter. Let them have their meetings. I'd do the paperwork, make sure the boxes were checked, and carry on. But as time passed, The frustration began to build. Alex wasn't just ignoring me, he was erasing my role entirely. The work didn't change. I still filed reports, completed audits, and tracked compliance. But the further I was pushed into the shadows, the more I began to feel that something was breaking. The machine wasn't running as smoothly anymore. I couldn't ignore it for much longer. Something was off. And I knew that if I didn't act soon, the consequences would be catastrophic. It happened during one of those routine vendor meetings, the kind I'd attended hundreds of times without issue. The room was filled with chatter about budgets and deliverables, but my mind was elsewhere, reviewing the compliance requirements in my notes. That's when Alex spoke up. "We need to streamline our processes. Compliance is just paperwork, right? It's something we can tackle later," he said, waving a hand dismissively. The room laughed. It wasn't a loud laugh, more of a nervous chuckle, as if everyone in the room knew they were supposed to laugh but didn't really find it funny. I felt my stomach twist. I had been dismissed by him before, but this time felt different. This time, he wasn't just ignoring my role, he was belittling it. And the others, they were complicit. Not a single person in the room spoke up. They all just followed his lead, pretending like the lifeblood of this company didn't depend on the very systems he was mocking. I stayed silent, but inside, something cracked. I had spent years quietly fixing issues, standing in the background, hoping someone would eventually recognize my worth. But now, that silent hope was gone. I pulled my phone from my bag, turning it on silently. Without drawing attention, I recorded his words. Every word he said was a thread in the tangled mess I knew would eventually unravel. As the meeting continued, I felt like an observer in my own body. It wasn't just the usual dismissal anymore. This was a deliberate attempt to undermine everything I'd worked for. The meeting ended. People shuffled out, talking about their next steps, oblivious to what had just happened, but not me. I had already made my decision. I wasn't going to stay quiet anymore. This was no longer about compliance. It was about accountability. Alex's negligence couldn't go unchallenged. I would gather the evidence, piece by piece, and when the time came, I would expose it all. I started my strategy that afternoon, preparing for the showdown I knew was inevitable. The more I dug, the worse it got. At first, it was just a hunch. Something about Alex's casual disregard for compliance wasn't sitting right with me. But then, I started pulling the threads. I began reviewing the vendor contracts that had passed through Alex's desk. One after another, I noticed something troubling. Key compliance checks had been skipped. There were missing signatures, incomplete forms, and glaring gaps where federal regulations should have been followed to the letter. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Alex had pushed through vendors without the necessary vetting, bypassing the system I had spent years helping to build. It was reckless. It was dangerous. And if it was allowed to continue, it would jeopardize everything. I checked the logs again this time, cross-referencing them with emails and the procurement reports. More mistakes. More shortcuts. I felt the weight of what I was uncovering with every new document. Alex wasn't just ignorant of compliance, he was actively undermining it. The contracts he'd signed off on, large federal contracts, no less, hadn't been properly vetted. The risks to the company were monumental. If these issues were discovered during an audit, the penalties would be severe. And I knew that, left unchecked. Alex would just keep pushing things through, pretending everything was fine. He had no idea how far I was willing to go to stop him. I wasn't going to confront him directly. That would be a mistake. Alex didn't respect the system, but I did. And I knew how to use it against him. I would expose him, but not in a way that would allow him to shrug it off or deny it. I would let the system he disregarded do the work for me. The pieces were falling into place, All I needed now was the right moment to set my plan into motion. And when it came, I would be ready. Alex's time was running out. I spent the next few days assembling the pieces of the puzzle I had uncovered. The evidence was damning, and I knew exactly how I would use it. I'd compiled the contracts, the emails, the procurement logs, and of course, the recording of Alex's flippant remark about compliance being just paperwork. Each document I reviewed only strengthened my resolve. The more I saw, the more I realized how dangerous Alex's behavior was to the company. His arrogance, his disregard for the rules, it couldn't go unchecked any longer. I knew I was taking a risk. Sending an email to the federal auditor wasn't a small decision. It would be noticed. There was no going back once I hit send. The company would be in turmoil and Alex's position would be at risk. But the truth was, I didn't care about the fallout anymore. The company's survival was at stake. If I stayed silent, if I let Alex continue down this path, we'd all be in jeopardy. I carefully crafted the email, attaching all the evidence I had gathered, the recording, the compliance breaches, the missing signatures, the lack of proper documentation, everything. I typed up the context, explaining the severity of the situation, and included a note. Please review the attached material at your earliest convenience. This is a matter of national security. It was a quiet confession, but a dangerous one. I stared at the screen for a long time, my finger hovering over the send button. There was no more room for hesitation. The time had come to expose the rot that had festered under Alex's leadership. As I prepared to hit send, I thought about the consequences. Would the auditor act on this? Would Alex finally face the consequences of his actions? Or would he find a way to spin it? I waited for a moment longer, but I wasn't backing down. The email was ready, and when I pressed send, there would be no turning back. With a steady hand, I clicked send. I wasn't sure what I expected after sending the email, but the silence that followed was almost deafening. The next morning, I arrived at my desk, but the usual calm was replaced with an undercurrent of tension. I knew something had shifted, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. That was until I saw the email notification from the federal auditor's office. They were here. I had expected this moment, but not so quickly. I gathered my things quietly, keeping my focus sharp as the team buzzed around me, unaware of what was unfolding. The auditor wasn't just reviewing the evidence. I had a feeling he had his own plan. When he walked into the building, I wasn't surprised to see him move through the hall with an air of authority. It wasn't a loud entrance. In fact, it was the opposite, methodical and quiet. He went straight to the boardroom, where a meeting had been scheduled to discuss routine operational updates. The room was already filled with senior leaders, including Alex. I could feel my pulse quicken. This was it. Without hesitation, the auditor started the meeting by placing his laptop on the table, his gaze fixed on Alex. The screen flickered to life, and I saw the recording appear. It was the moment I'd been waiting for, the moment Alex's careless words would be exposed. Compliance is just paperwork. The recording blared, and I could hear the murmur in the room. I glanced around, watching the expressions of the board members shift from confusion to realization. Alex's face drained of color. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His usual confidence faltered, and the room fell silent. All eyes on him. The auditor didn't give him a chance to regain his composure. "Explain this," he said, his voice cutting through the thick tension in the air. Alex stammered, trying to salvage the situation, but his words only dug him deeper into a hole. The board, once his supporters, began to look at him with suspicion, doubt, and then shock. I sat back, watching the collapse unfold with a calmness I hadn't expected. I'd known this was coming, But seeing it happen was something else entirely. The morning after the auditor's visit felt like the calm before a storm. I didn't expect things to go back to normal, but I wasn't prepared for the level of chaos that followed. The company had been rocked to its core. Alex, once the rising star, was placed on immediate administrative leave, pending an investigation. The email announcements came flooding in with a tone that could only be described as swift and clinical. I watched as one by one, colleagues began to gossip in hushed tones. I hadn't expected applause or celebration, but the silence was louder than I thought it would be. The tension in the air was palpable, and I knew the other leaders in the company were already scrambling to recover from the damage Alex had caused. By the end of the day, I received an unexpected email from the CEO. My promotion was official. I was quietly reinstated to a more visible leadership position in compliance, one that would require me to oversee the cleanup of the mess Alex had created. There was no fanfare, no thank you note, just a brief mention of appreciation for my thoroughness and an acknowledgement that compliance would now have a larger role in the company's future operations. But not everyone was thrilled with my new position. I could feel the undercurrents of doubt from colleagues who were unsure about how far I'd gone to expose Alex. HR Director Elise Carter, who was always focused on maintaining the peace, asked me if I thought my actions had been too extreme. Legal head Martha Lee, whose silence in the meeting still stung, privately told me I'd crossed a line. They were uncomfortable with how I'd handled things, unsure whether going straight to the auditor was the right approach. I didn't back down. What I did was necessary. The company was barely holding together after Alex's incompetence, and I was the only one who could help steer it back on course. The fallout wasn't just about Alex anymore. It was about the corporate politics that continued to simmer beneath the surface. It was clear that some people didn't fully understand the choices I had made, but I had no intention of apologizing. I knew what I had to do, and I wasn't done yet. The days that followed Alex's suspension felt like a whirlwind. The company was still reeling from the fallout, scrambling to clean up the mess left behind. But amid the chaos, something unexpected happened. I began to feel the weight of my own actions. I had done what needed to be done, exposed the truth, but the cost wasn't lost on me. The relationships I'd spent years building with some colleagues began to fray. HR Director Elise Carter stopped by my desk once, her eyes tight with concern. She mentioned that some people were questioning my methods. Legal head Martha Lee barely made eye contact with me anymore. They didn't say it outright, but I could feel the discomfort in the air, like they weren't sure if I'd crossed a line. But despite the strain, I knew I had made the right choice. As the investigation into Alex continued, I couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of justice. The board had finally seen what I had been fighting for all these years, the importance of compliance, the necessity of doing things the right way. And now, they were listening. They weren't just looking past me anymore. They were looking at me. My role had shifted in a way I hadn't anticipated. I wasn't the quiet worker in the background anymore, the one whose concerns were always brushed aside. No. Now I was someone they turned to, someone who had the answers. I felt a surge of pride, but also a sense of responsibility. I wasn't just cleaning up the mess anymore, I was leading the way forward. And as I sat at my desk, reviewing the latest compliance reports, I realized something. I wasn't just the one who kept the company from falling apart. I was the one who could help reshape it. I had the authority now, and I intended to use it. But with that power came a new weight. The corporate world wasn't going to suddenly start singing my praises. There were those who resented the changes I was pushing for, those who would try to silence me if they could. I wasn't done yet. I was just getting started. It felt different now. Stepping into my new role, for the first time in my career, I wasn't just cleaning up after others, I was leading the charge. The board was listening. The executives were following, and I was finally in a position to make the changes I had always known were necessary. The first task was simple, establish compliance as a core part of the company's operations, not just a department tucked away in the corner. I rolled out new procedures, ones that would ensure vendors were properly vetted, contracts were thoroughly reviewed, and every aspect of the business adhered to federal guidelines. It wasn't going to be a quick fix, but I wasn't interested in quick fixes. I wanted sustainable change. I wanted to make sure nothing like Alex's negligence ever happened again. I also took the opportunity to mentor the younger employees, teaching them the value of doing things the right way, even when no one was watching. I had spent years learning the hard way, finding out how to navigate a system that wasn't designed to be easy. I wasn't about to let the next generation fall into the same traps I had, but despite the progress, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that corporate politics hadn't gone anywhere. The game was still being played behind closed doors, and some people, those who had profited from Alex's rise, wouldn't be so easily swayed. I had learned that much in my years here. So, I stayed vigilant. I documented everything. Meetings, decisions, emails, nothing was left to chance. I couldn't afford to be complacent, not when so much was at stake. I knew the company was in a fragile place. The lessons from Alex's downfall were still fresh, but how long would it take for people to forget? How long before the temptation to cut corners crept back into the system? I wasn't about to let it happen. Not while I still had the reins. I sat across from Evan Shaw, the CEO, in the same glass-walled office where I'd once been invisible. He looked tired, the kind of tired that comes from realizing the weight of past mistakes. His eyes met mine, and for the first time, there was no arrogance in his gaze, only a quiet acknowledgement of everything I'd warned him about. "Caroline, I want to apologize," he said, his voice more measured than usual. "You were right all along. I should have listened to you sooner." I felt a flicker of something satisfaction, perhaps, but not quite victory. I had been right. That much was clear. But the apology wasn't what I was waiting for. It didn't change the fact that the company had suffered under Alex's leadership, and the damage had to be repaired. "I appreciate your apology," I said, my voice calm but firm. "But it's not just about being right. It's about the future, about making sure this doesn't happen again." He nodded, as though he knew exactly what I meant. His gaze shifted to the files on his desk, files he had neglected, ignored, and, at times, discarded in favor of quicker, easier solutions. I wasn't about to let the company slip back into those habits. Compliance is never just paperwork, I continued, leaning forward slightly. It's the foundation that everything else is built on. Without it, this company doesn't have a leg to stand on. I won't let anyone forget that again. Evan's expression softened, but I knew he was thinking about the larger picture, the mess I had cleaned up, the wake of Alex's downfall. He wasn't sure how to move forward with someone like me at the helm of compliance, but he would, because he had no other choice. As I left the room, I felt the weight of everything I'd fought for settle into place. I had reshaped the company. In my quiet way, they had underestimated me once, but never again. I was no longer just the compliance officer. I was the one holding the keys to the company's future, and that, more than any apology, was all I needed.